Richard, I'm so glad you could join us today and get us sort of up to speed on fracking. And would love to hear, before you dive into that, would just love to hear a bit of your story. How did you how did you get into this field? And give us a little snapshot, and then if you could then go through your presentation about fracking, and then I want to let people know we'll have time for Q&A, and we'll do closing thoughts from Richard and wrap it up and try to do this all within 75 minutes. And so, Richard, over to you. A bit about yourself and then into the presentation.
Yeah, okay. Well, I don't know. I read a book called Limits to Growth back in 1972 when it came out, and it changed my life. I basically realized for the first time, I was 21 years old when I read it, so I realized for the first time in my young life at that time that the world was on an unsustainable path, and I've basically been trying to figure out what that means and what to do about it ever since. And that led me in the late 1990s to a exploration of what's now called peak oil, because it became apparent to a number of us around that time that oil would probably be the first critical resource to push the world past the limits to growth. And I think the events have borne that out. I wrote a book called The Party's Over, which was published in 2003. Rob Hopkins read that book and invited me to participate in a seminar that he put on in Kinsale, Ireland in 2005. So I met Rob then, and we've been in touch ever since. And I've endeavored to support transition efforts any way I can since the very beginning. So I guess maybe that's enough background.
Yeah, and also, Richard, reminds me that you were one of the first board members on Transition US as well a few years ago. So thank you for your service in that regard too.
Sure. Yeah. Good. Well, the context for this presentation is the following. Ever since the beginning of transition, the sort of the driving global forces have been basically peak oil and climate change. You know, these are the reasons we have to get off of fossil fuels as quickly as possible. And in the last couple of years, there's been an enormous public relations push on the part of the fossil fuel industry against both of these things, basically saying, don't worry, drive on, keep consuming. There's plenty of fossil fuels, and climate change is, you know, even if it's happening, it's not for decades. And what we really need right now is economic growth, you know, to pay for alternative energy and all kinds of things. And the only way we're going to get that growth is to keep our foot on the accelerator with regard to fossil fuels. So it's kind of a paradoxical message in that way, but that's what policymakers are listening to. One of the big developments in the last couple of years that has helped the fossil fuel industry in its public relations efforts is increasing production of natural gas and oil from hydrofracturing and horizontal drilling. U.S. natural gas production has hit an all-time peak, which nobody foresaw. None of us in the peak oil community foresaw that a few years ago, as a result of fracking and horizontal drilling. U.S. oil production is up, and noticeably, 2012 saw the biggest increase in U.S. oil production in decades. So, you know, this is not entirely hype. The fossil fuel industry is indeed having some significant successes. Now, it's important to understand what the context of that success is. Basically, the last 8 years, U.S. oil production in total has been flat. Since 2005, if you just count crude oil and exclude things like biofuels and butane and stuff that we don't use for transportation, it's really not the same thing as oil. If you just count regular conventional crude, we're about the same amount of production in 2012 as we were in 2005. So the oil prices, as a result of stagnant oil production, oil prices have soared to near record levels. The world price of oil right now is over $110 a barrel. U.S. price is about 95. But this is, the inflation-adjusted normal price of oil is about $20 a barrel if you look back through the decades. So the price of oil has gone crazy and production has gone flat. So the overall context would support the peak oil hypothesis, near-term peak oil hypothesis. But then we're seeing this new production of natural gas and oil in the U.S. What's going on there? We've seen extraordinary claims on the part of the fossil fuel industry with regard to these resources, the shale gas and tight oil resources. Sometimes, by the way, it's called, people say shale oil, but that's confusing because there's also this stuff out in Colorado and Wyoming that's actually kerogen, but it's often called oil shale or shale oil. And the stuff that's being produced in the Bakken play in North Dakota and the Eagle Ford play in Texas is a completely different resource from the stuff out west in Colorado and Wyoming. And so calling the stuff in the Bakken in North Dakota and also at the Eagle Ford in Texas, calling that shale oil really confuses the picture. So it's better to call that tight oil because it's coming from tight reservoirs, low porosity, low permeability rocks, mostly shale, that yield their oil only with difficulty and only with the application of these new technologies of horizontal drilling and hydrofracturing. So the claims that are being made are that we have between 100 and 200 years of natural gas, presumably at current prices, because the price of natural gas has gone down with this spate of new production. It hasn't happened with oil. Price of oil has stayed where it was, even with increasing U.S. production. The reason for that is that natural gas is a regionally traded commodity. There's a certain amount that's traded globally on LNG tankers, liquefied natural gas tankers, but not that much in comparison to the global oil trade. Oil is traded globally, and as a result, there's pretty much a global price. West Texas Intermediate sells for a little bit less than Brent crude, but it's mostly because of local economics. There happens to be a temporary glut of oil in Cushing, Oklahoma, that causes the WTI price to be lower than the Brent price, which is what most countries are paying. It's actually what most U.S. refineries are paying for oil, is the higher price, about $110. So a little bit of extra U.S. production is not going to affect oil prices, unlike natural gas prices. Nevertheless, we're hearing that increased production from the Bakken and the Eagle Ford is going to result in the U.S. being energy independent. We will increase our oil productions to the point where it's higher than that of Saudi Arabia. And the phrase Saudi America is being used here and there. And of course, the oil industry has jumped all over the idea of a near-term peak in global oil production, saying, well, you know, if oil production in North Dakota is going up, then world oil production couldn't possibly peak anytime soon. So this is a problem for those of us who have been telling folks in our communities about peak oil as well as climate change for these last number of years. In some ways, our credibility is at stake. So we at Post Carbon Institute have undertaken some efforts with regard to all of this, and the major one is a report that was just released 2 days ago that you will find on this website. So for all of the technical details that I will discuss today, go to this website and you will find all of the ammunition that you need. Why does the thing keep advancing without my wanting it to? Just stay there for a minute, okay? Okay, it's not going to stay there. I guess once the slideshow gets going, it has a mind of its own. That's not very helpful. Okay, well, we'll just turn off the slideshow for the time being. Okay, so this is an enormous report. It took us 9 months to put together. The lead author is a petroleum geologist named David Hughes, who had a long career with the Canadian Geological Survey. He's one of North America's premier experts on natural gas and coal supplies. The report is about 188 pages long. What he did was to analyze 63,000 currently producing oil and gas wells that were hydraulically fractured and horizontally drilled. All of the formations, all of the geological formations or plays that are currently producing or likely to produce shale gas or tight oil were analyzed. So this is the best analysis to date by anyone, including the International Energy Agency or the U.S. Department of Energy, on this subject. We're very proud of that fact. Also, in today's issue of Nature magazine, which is the world's premier scientific journal, there is an invited op-ed piece by David Hughes. Unfortunately, it's behind a paywall, but it's a substantial piece, and within the scientific community, this is as good as it gets in terms of credibility. So let me walk you through some of this. Also, another thing we're doing is that I am at work on a new book, which is titled Snake Oil: How the Petroleum Industry's Misleading Promise of Plenty Imperils Our Future. And I wanted to read a little section to you on how to frack an oil or gas well. And you know, maybe I can do it actually from this computer. I won't be able to see you, but I'll just open Word. Suppose you want to get in on the fracking game. Here's a short introduction, or excuse me, instruction manual to get you started. So this is basically just to, as a layman's guide to what this is actually all about, what it looks like on the ground and what's involved. Start with a geological survey. You need to know where the gas or oil is, and you'll probably wish to operate within one of the plays already identified by the industry, such as the Marcellus in Pennsylvania, or the Eagle Ford in southern Texas, or the Bakken in North Dakota. But you need more than the general information that you can glean from the U.S. Department of Energy and USGS websites. You need to know the location of sweet spots within those plays where production will be highest. That knowledge you will be able to obtain only by purchasing proprietary drilling data, which we did, by the way, to produce our report, and by drilling your own test wells. Sooner or later, you will need drilling leases, rights purchased from landowners to exploit subsurface mineral resources. Start with a search of land ownership records at county offices. Actual lease negotiations and signings may take place on doorsteps or kitchen tables in rural homes, as in the recent film Promised Land, which I recommend that you see, by the way. You may want to load your boilerplate agreement with language that allows you to build roads, buildings, gates, drilling pads, and pipelines anywhere on the owner's property, to interfere with farming, hunting, timber rights, conservation programs, and other land uses, to take millions of gallons of water from the owner's wells, to leave the landowner liable for any damages caused to neighbors by your drilling practices, and to store wastewater and chemicals on the land. You will offer the property owner an upfront bonus payment per acre from $500 to several $1,000s, depending on a variety of factors, plus royalties that promise a percentage of the value of oil or gas that's produced. The lease will give you a 4 to 5 year deadline to drill. If a well is drilled, the lease stays in effect for as long as the well produces. Once you know where you want to drill and you have a leasing agreement in hand, you're ready to get to work. Plan the drilling site, and if you're drilling for gas, the pipeline route by which to move your product to market. Send some workers with earth-moving equipment to clear an area for the drilling operations. You'll need an earthen berm enclosing a football field-sized site. The drilling rig itself is a 120-foot high steel structure of platforms surrounding a huge rotary drill. That can be rented and assembled from about 60 tractor trailer loads of equipment. Drilling will probably take you 2 or 3 weeks, with steel pipe being lowered down the hole as the drill bit chews its way straight down a mile or two, then turns laterally to drill outward another few thousand feet. You'll cement special steel pipe called casing into place in the uppermost parts of the well. This will protect groundwater and stabilize the well for the next stages of the process, assuming it works. You're now ready to slide a device known as a perforating gun down into the deepest portion of the well. This sets off small explosive charges that punch holes in the well in the horizontal steel production casing. Once that's accomplished, it's necessary to flush the system with diluted acid to unclog the holes in the casing. Now comes the hydrofracturing stage. Bring huge pumps in on semi-trucks along with 400 to 600 tanker loads of fracking fluids. With the pumps, drive a few million gallons of water mixed with fine silica sand down into the horizontal leg of the casing, forcing the water through the holes to make hairline cracks in the shale rock. Then add microscopic grains of sand to the water to prop open the cracks. After the well is fracked, you will pump back water and fracking fluid for several days to open up the well bore so that oil or gas can flow out. You may recapture the fracking fluid for reuse in the next job, or you might decide to put it in an evaporation pond or send it off to a municipal treatment facility, which will be poorly equipped to deal with it. If you've been drilling for gas, you will now cap the well until you've constructed a pipeline to connect it with larger transmission pipes. If it's an oil well, you may be able to start production right away and move the product by truck and rail tanker. Now it's time to drill the next well on your pad. Its horizontal leg will point in a different direction from the first. Once several wells have been drilled and you've finished with the pad, just break down the rented drilling rig so its owner can truck it away to the next site. Most of your work is done. As soon as you've opened the tap and started production from your new oil or gas well, you can also rehabilitate some of the land around the drilling site, leaving a fenced area the size of maybe a large living room with several pipes protruding. Along the way, you will have had to move a lot of equipment, water, and chemicals. Altogether, each well will have generated around 2,000 18-wheel truck trips, with an 8-well pad site needing roughly 14 to 20,000 trips. Hiring personnel, renting the drilling rig, paying for the lease, hiring trucks, all of this is expensive. By the time you turn on the tap, you will probably have invested $10 to $20 million on your well pad, which, if you've been drilling for gas, may produce only $6 to $15 million worth of product over its lifetime at today's prices. If it's an oil well, you're more likely to show a profit, though there's no guarantee. So why does anybody bother? Okay, so that's just a little excerpt from the um, book. Now I want to get to talking about the uh, the reports. Now again, you can download the report and the summary of the report for free. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here talking to you about the report. These are just a few slides showing you the situation I was talking about earlier with basically the oil industry and how it's changed in recent years. Okay, let's get into the report. Now, okay, this is an interesting slide. This is the U.S. Department of Energy's recent estimates for world oil production. As you can see, every year they have to revise downward. And so when you see an EIA or EIA projection of future world oil production, it has to be taken with a big grain of salt. And the EIA even did a retrospective study of its own work, and it found that for natural gas and crude oil, it has this interesting tendency to overestimate production most of the time. Okay, here we are looking at the actual plays for natural gas and oil. You'll have to look at this on the report itself to be able to blow it up and read what these are. But as you can see, there are 2 or 3 in Texas that are pretty important. The Barnett, that's the oldest of the shale gas plays, and the Eagle Ford, which produces mostly oil these days. Up in North Dakota, the Bakken, and back east in New York, Pennsylvania, the Marcellus, and that's the one that's most interesting right now because it's the one area that's still actually increasing in rate of production. Most people don't understand this. The older shale gas plays have already gone into decline. Talking about the Barnett, which was the first, the Haynesville. And the reason is the decline rates in individual shale gas wells and also tight oil wells are very, very high. After just a few months of production, the rate of production has fallen dramatically in a typical well. So in total, shale gas production has already this picture shows you the different plays and rate of production. Unfortunately, this damn thing just has a mind of its own. It keeps going. The rate of production is already leveled off, and will probably start to decline in just a few years. The reason I called this presentation "Treadmill to Hell" is that these high rates of decline in individual wells mean that in order to keep total production flat or increasing, the number of wells drilled has to be just astronomical and has to continue. And so when in a place like the Barnett, where this has been going on for a while, they've literally started to run out of places to drill. And when that happens, then the individual well high decline rates kick in, and it means that production from the Barnett is going to start declining pretty rapidly fairly soon. This page just shows some of the problems with this extreme technology, and that's what it is. It's a problem of the low-hanging fruit. We've already used the conventional oil and gas, and now what we're producing from is these tight shale rocks with low porosity that require the hydrofracturing and horizontal drilling, which requires higher investment and entails high decline rates. So this is not a panacea. It's, we have to drill more to get less. Look at the comparison between individual well productivity, how much a typical well produces, and the number of gas wells that have to be drilled. The number of gas wells that have been drilled is increasing. Meanwhile, the individual well productivity is declining. Again, it's a treadmill to hell. Okay. This is daily production versus number of wells per year. That's basically showing the same data in a different way. Let's see if we can get to. Yeah, the U.S. Department of Energy itself doesn't expect U.S. oil production to continue increasing past about 2017 to 2020, but they're assuming that once we've bumped production up, it'll decline only a little bit, and U.S. oil production will go back onto a kind of a plateau. We think that's extremely unlikely because they're not taking into account the high per well decline rates also of the shale oil wells, as in the Bakken and Eagle Ford, which look about like that. So once all of the available drilling sites are used up, in around, which according to our calculations will happen around 2017, less than 5 years from now, then again the per well decline rates, high decline rates will kick in. And instead of tight oil, assuming kind of a plateau, it's going to decline very rapidly in the 2020s. It will continue for a very long time, but at extremely low rate compared to what we're seeing now or will see over the next 3 to 5 years. Again, we don't have time to go into all of the detail. You can read that for yourself. Annual drilling rate of 65,000 wells per year in 2035. Now, is that likely? We find it extremely unlikely, because as the best drilling sites are used up, and of course, once again, the low-hanging fruit phenomenon, the oil and gas industry is going after the sweet spots first, the high-quality drilling sites first. So as they push out into the peripheral zones of these plays, like the Marcellus and the Eagle Ford and the Barnett and Bakken, the individual well productivity declines, and the per well production rate declines increase. So for how long is this going to be economic? Probably not much longer. Already the cost of production for shale gas in the U.S. is noticeably higher than the wellhead price that the companies receive. They're actually losing money on every cubic foot of natural gas produced. So how can that be? How can the industry be apparently so successful and yet losing money? Well, what's going on here is another financial bubble, and this is described in another report that we released at the same time on Tuesday. This one by Deborah Rogers, who is a longtime financial analyst. She's also an organic goat dairy farmer who has a farm right in the middle of Fort Worth, Texas, which is right in the middle of the Barnett Shale. So she saw this happening all around her, horizontal drilling rigs popping up in all the neighboring properties, and it was having a health impact on her goats, as well as, you know, enormous problems with noise and air quality and all the rest. So she started investigating the economics of shale gas, and with her financial experience, she was on the advisory board of the Dallas Federal Reserve for some time, and so on. So she's a highly skilled and respected financial analyst. She started looking into the balance sheets of the companies that specialize in fracking, like Chesapeake, Devon, EOG, etc. There are quite a number of these smaller companies that have spearheaded and it's mostly smaller companies. The reason for that is they're willing to take on more risk than the big majors like ExxonMobil, Shell, and so on. So the smaller companies have led the way, and Wall Street has paved the way for them by helping out with the hyped claims for reserves and potential production. The CEO of Chesapeake Energy is a guy named Aubrey McClendon. He was forced to resign in disgrace recently, but he has been one of the most vociferous spokesmen for shale gas, and he commonly says, "Oh, well, we have not just 100 years of cheap natural gas, but 200 years, not just a Saudi Arabia's worth of natural gas, but two Saudi." He's constantly upping the ante. And this is why I titled my book Snake Oil, because these guys are snake oil salesmen. It's just like hucksters at a carnival a century ago. They're basically selling us their product, but because they're the only ones who have been doing the analysis, the U.S. Department of Energy has gotten on board with these unrealistic figures. When you hear President Obama give a State of the Union address and say that we have 100 years of natural gas, where does that number come from? Well, ultimately it comes from Aubrey McClendon, and he's about as believable as the guys who sold us Enron. So Deborah Rogers' conclusion is that what we are seeing is another financial bubble. Wall Street makes money on shale oil or shale gas and tight oil on the way up and the way down. On the way up, it's investors buying shares in these companies. And once the companies start losing money hand over fist because it costs them more to produce the stuff than they can get by selling it, then the value of their stock shares starts falling, as has happened with some of these companies recently. And then they have to go to liquidation or acquisitions and mergers, and Wall Street makes money there too. It's not the Wall Street investment bank's money that's invested in these companies. It's the money of pension funds and smaller investors all over the place. It's the housing bubble all over again, only in the energy sector rather than the real estate sector. So what's the bottom line on this? We're coming right up on our time. The bottom line is it's really important for some of us to have a perspective on this. And those of us who are involved in transition are very well placed in our communities to be sounding the alarm in this regard and helping people in our communities understand that these fuels have been overhyped. And the argument for getting off of fossil fuels is not just an environmental argument. Now, one of the tragedies that I've seen over the past few months is that a number of climate activists have taken these numbers from the shale gas and tight oil industry, taken these numbers at face value. I'm thinking now of the British environmentalist George Monbiot, who had written very favorably about peak oil and included it in his sort of global analysis for a number of years. And then just last year he said, "Oh no, peak oil was all wrong. There's all this stuff out there, and horizontal drilling and coming up with enormous amounts." And so he basically signed off on peak oil, and he said, well, the only thing we should concentrate on is climate change. I think that's strategically it's a mistake, and the reason is if you seed the ground on production potential to the snake oil salesman, then the policy discussion is all about jobs versus climate. Okay, if we go down one route and allow hydrofracturing, then we get all the oil and gas we need in order to grow the economy and create jobs. But if, on the other hand, we put climate first and foremost, well, we save the climate, but we say no to all of this economic growth and all of these millions of jobs. Well, what do you think people are going to do? What is President Obama doing? he clearly said he wants to protect the climate as long as it doesn't mean endangering any potential jobs. He's also adopted an energy policy of all the above, right? And that's because he believes, on the basis of the numbers that Aubrey McClendon is telling him, that the U.S. has 100 years of cheap natural gas and is about to become Saudi America. Well, these claims, as it turns out, are bogus. And as our report demonstrates, they're nothing but a tissue of lies and hype. That message has to get out loud and clear so that people understand it's not a choice between, rosy economic growth, lots of jobs future on one hand, and hair shirt climate protection on the other. The fact is, either we protect the climate or we have no future. Neither an economic future nor a future of an intact planet. So strategically, we believe at Post Carbon Institute that it's the message of understanding that this is all hype is strategically important for the climate discussion. So I'm past my time now, and it's probably a good idea for us to get into questions. There are a lot of things I didn't cover that I had wanted to, but maybe we can get to them in questions.
So for those of you who have questions, you can type them on the screen, and Richard and I can respond. There you go.
Okay, what kind of plan is in the works to show Obama another way to employ Americans if we can't drill? Well, this is a much bigger question because it really gets to how we organize the economy. Drilling is not going to supply Americans with all the jobs that are being promised. And even the jobs that have appeared in North Dakota and Texas are mostly short-term jobs, and they're not very pleasant. In some cases, they're very well-paying jobs, but again, short-term. The renewable energy industry is going to require a lot of labor, and the reason for that is that it's more labor and land intensive. Drilling an oil well doesn't take much land. It's especially a traditional conventional oil well. It's just a little spot on the Earth's surface, and yet it produces all this energy. To get as much energy from that oil well, from solar panels or wind turbines, you need acres and acres and acres of panels or turbines, and that means more infrastructure cost, more labor, not only in installation but also in maintenance. So that also implies a lower energy return on energy invested. It means a different kind of society and a different kind of economy. But yes, it does mean more people involved in the energy sector in terms of labor. So if your concern is all about jobs, then clearly renewable energy is the way to go. It's going to produce more jobs. There's no question about it.
Richard?
Yeah, Bill McKibben's idea about divesting from fossil fuels and convincing, for example, I don't know if everybody can see. Can everybody see these questions on their screens?
Let's read them out.
Yeah. What do you think about McKibben's ideas of divestment campaign against the rogue corporations, oil and gas companies? Yeah. Well, I think it's an interesting strategy. The real impact of that is not so much financial on the oil and gas industry. Partly because the oil and gas companies are only a small they're only small bit players on the global stage. I mean, if you want to protect the climate, it's a global enterprise. Even if we succeed here in the U.S., if we fail in China and the rest of the world, then we're still going to hell. And elsewhere in the world, the vast majority of oil and gas is produced by national oil companies that aren't traded on the stock market. China's oil and gas and coal are all owned by the government, basically, and same thing with Saudi Arabia and so on. So the divestment campaign at 350 is not going to touch any of that. What it will do is change public perceptions. Just as with apartheid, the divestment campaign, well, in that case, it was more successful in actually hurting the companies that did business with South Africa. But it also changed people's perceptions about the morality of doing business with Saudi Arabia. And this could change people's perceptions about the morality of the fossil fuel industry and supporting the fossil fuel industry in various ways. To what degree, I don't know. But I think that's really their ultimate goal with this campaign, rather than having an actual financial impact. What's Transition doing or planning on doing in the communities to carry the message and lead on actions? What can the audience do? Helping get this message out would be enormously helpful. If you know of influential people in government, in finance, in business, or politics, pass along to them, or in the media, please pass along to them this report that we just produced. It is an authoritative document, and we expect that the fossil fuel industry will try to ignore it as much as possible because they can't refute it. It's their numbers. We used their databases to produce this document, and so they can't refute the numbers. What they can do is try to get it ignored by mainstream media and by policymakers. Basically try to kill it. So getting it out in front of people is really important. Then it depends on where your transition effort is located. If it's in Southern California, you should be concerned about fracking there, because there is frackable shale in the Monterey Play there, and there's a lot of discussion right now in policy levels as to whether to put in place, policies that would either inhibit or encourage fracking in the Monterey Shale. Or if you live in Pennsylvania or Ohio or New York, you know that these are big issues already in your community. Get involved. This is political, but this is really a big part of our future in those communities, in those places, and of course Texas and Oklahoma and Arkansas and Louisiana, all of these states, Colorado, Wyoming, North Dakota. So, yeah, get involved locally. Why don't we have a true full cost accounting on natural gas and oil, in particular the full cost of adverse health effects are tremendous. My research has long led me to be confident that much of the increase in allergy, asthma, and so on. I guess there wasn't room for all of the comment from David on this. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Well, we don't do full cost accounting in our economy on just about anything. If we really did full cost accounting on absolutely everything, I don't think we could maintain an industrial economy, quite frankly. But certainly there's a good argument to be made for doing it to much greater degree with oil and natural gas and coal. And if we did that with coal, for example, certainly coal would cease to be the cheapest energy source. Even in places like China, it would jump right to the top of the heap in terms of costs. Related to this, I think it's really important for folks to know that with natural gas, one of the reasons that people like Andy Revkin of the New York Times, he has an environmental blog for the New York Times, but Andy Revkin is in favor of gas fracking. And why? Because natural gas produces lower greenhouse gas emissions than coal. So his thinking is, okay, if we use natural gas as a bridge fuel, we have 100 years of natural gas. We've been told that by Aubrey McClendon. Why would he lie? So we know that, right? And President Obama repeated that assertion, so it must be true. So we have 100 years of natural gas, and natural gas burns cleaner than coal. Therefore, as a transition fuel, we should adopt natural gas, encourage fracking, and then that buys us time to invest more in solar and wind. Well, what's wrong with that? Well, a number of things are wrong with it. First of all, we don't have 100 years of natural gas. We have maybe 5 years before, very serious natural gas production declines kick in, and much higher natural gas prices are inevitable. Maybe only 3-4 years. Then when we say that natural gas burns cleaner than coal, well, that's true at the burner tip. If you only count the CO2 emissions in the power plant where you're burning natural gas, then it has a better greenhouse gas profile than coal. But if you take the full life cycle into account, it's a very different picture. It turns out that especially in fracking operations, there's a lot of methane, which is what natural gas is. There's a lot of methane that's released into the atmosphere inadvertently. As much as 6 to 8% of the total amount of methane that's leaving that gas well is leaving as fugitive methane into the atmosphere. Methane over the short term, over the first 10 years, is about 100 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as CO2. This in turn means that over the short term, let's say over the first 25 to 50 years, natural gas actually is worse for the climate than burning coal. Now, this changes the equation entirely. And if people like Andy Revkin and George Monbiot and other environmentalists really understood that, they would not be promoting natural gas as a bridge fuel. It makes no economic sense, and it makes no environmental sense. Where do we get a copy of your document? Well, my book is unfortunately not going to be available. This is really a rush job. I'm trying to get this out by June. So hopefully you'll be able to get a copy of that book by June. The introduction to the book will be published as my February newsletter, probably early next week. So if you go to richardheinberg.com, you'll be able to read the introduction to the book. Now, the report that I've been reading from, which is much more important because that's the real data. You can get that right now for free as a free PDF download at the website that I showed earlier, which I don't have in front of me right now, but you can find a link to that at postcarbon.org, postcarbon.org. Yeah, you can also go to resilience.org. Somebody is reminding me, but for this one, I would recommend postcarbon.org.
Richard, there was a question. There's one that Desiree. I think we also have one from David Wimberly about deep transition. get a chance. Go ahead. That's a
Okay,
question.
well, I see one on the screen. Yeah, Colorado is very actively working towards a statewide ban on fracking. Do you think this is very realistic? Yes, I do, and I think it would be much more realistic if the people who were working for the ban had our data to help with their argument. Because right now the argument is probably being framed this way. On one hand, fracking could make a lot of jobs and make a lot of people wealthy. On one hand, or on the other hand, we could protect the environment. And guess who's going to win that argument? But if it's clear that any economic gain to the state is going to be very short term, and and of questionable not only duration but also magnitude, then I think it's a much easier argument. Is it worth it to drill thousands and thousands of wells? Because that's what we're talking about with fracking operations. You can't do it with a few hundred wells well placed here and there. The fracking treadmill is relentless. In order to make production rates increase or to keep production rates going, it takes continual drilling of thousands and thousands of wells. That's why we had to analyze almost 65,000 wells, because that's how many have been drilled so far. And they're planning on drilling that many and more in the next few years. So that's the scale of environmental impact that we're talking about. So is it really worth it to do that for just a few years of, a few hundred jobs and a little bit of economic impact to the state? I think it's a pretty strong argument that it's not worth it. You get a boomtown economy, boom and bust, and everybody ends up losing.
Thank you. There is a question. I think I'll read it to you, Richard. And it's in changing hearts and minds for deep transition. I'm interested in your work with Joanna Macy. Could you talk about the best ways you have found to work in those ways towards inner transition? And what about the inner transition for all of the organizations in society? That they surely need it urgently. So any comments about sort of that inner transition piece, the behavior change piece, and the difficulty with digesting some of this information, and et cetera?
Yeah, well, there are other people who maybe are better placed to talk to that. There certainly is an inner psychological transition that we all go through with regard to this information and just living in these times. And you don't go through it once and for all. You don't engage with these issues for 2 or 3 years and then you're over it and you're perfectly well adjusted and happy. And I think ideally one can be well adjusted and happy and deal with these issues. And in fact, if you're not well adjusted and happy, if you don't have things in your life that give you joy and pleasure and connect you to other people and to the natural world, then you should limit your contact with this information, because it can be disturbing. You need a base of personal psychological stability to work from if you're going to be an effective advocate for action on these kinds of issues, because it is inherently disturbing information. Those of us who have decided to work with this information have made a deliberate choice. We've said, look, the world is going through an emergency and it needs help. And I'm willing to put parts of my life on hold, in effect, in order to devote attention to this, knowing that it's going to be costly in various ways to not only myself personally, but also to the people around me. So that's an ongoing negotiation, and we have to decide how much we're willing to, I don't want to use the word sacrifice, but engage how much engagement actually makes sense. Those of us who spend hours a day looking at our computers, keeping up with this information, need to take time off from time to time and close the computer, go out and spend time with the chickens, spend time with your loved ones, get out the guitar, make some music with friends. So fortunately that's mostly what transition is about, really, is not so much engaging with the data as taking the implications of that data into the community, into actions that really are life affirming and happy and enjoyable. So it's really all about maintaining that balance, and that requires some self-awareness and self-criticism to see if you maybe are going over the edge one way or the other.
Richard, thank you. I have a couple of questions myself. You're familiar, obviously, with the transition movement and transition work, and said earlier on that one of the activities that transition groups could engage in is really getting the right information into the hands of influential people within their locales. And just wondering if you had anything to add in terms of what you think would be really some things that folks involved in transition would be particularly well suited to do to move awareness of all of this forward.
Okay, let's see, how could I be more specific about this? Well, especially if your transition initiative is located in one of the areas where fracking is taking place, you might want to locate the people who are already working in the issue in your community. Maybe those people are already part of your transition effort, but if not, invite them in, and volunteer to help with their efforts. You're really working very much along the same lines. Transition should be an inclusive process, and some of the people in our communities are people who want more fracking because they're convinced it will bring more jobs, or maybe it'll bring them personally more profit. Well, we'd want to be inclusive. We don't want to alienate those people, but the fact is, what transition is all about, at the bottom line, is a transition away from fossil fuels. We can't let that go. We can't let that basic fundamental fact be obscured. And so sometimes that means choosing sides. And I think with hydrofracking and also with the Keystone Pipeline, we have sort of watershed moments where we really have to take sides as people and as communities.
Thank you. There's just something I wanted to mention in terms of transition being involved sort of in the fracking issue. That's a lovely little sort of case study or story from Wales. And the transition group in Wales, there was fracking coming into that particular area, township. And the transition initiative there hosted a lot of informational evenings and really got the populace really aware of the issues, the dangers, the possibilities of water pollution, et cetera, et cetera. Really got people very well educated, well beyond the snake oil hype. And so consequently, the population decided they didn't want it. And then the transition group really was the front of a movement that was really born out of the groundswell that it helped to create. So I thought that was a lovely success story and a good way to potentially for transition groups to work on this issue. Just wanted to presence that. And I wanted to ask you one, I think, final question and give you some time for closing thoughts. But is there anything, is there such a thing, or could you imagine there being such a thing as clean fracking?
Frankly, no. This is desperate technology, and sometimes the opponents of fracking do engage in hyperbole. It's true that not every fracked oil or gas well is going to immediately pollute groundwater. Most of them are done in a way that the industry would consider safe. They avoid direct pollution of groundwater every way they can. But if you stand back and look at the process of the thousands of truck trips, the resources themselves that are being produced, oil and natural gas, the methane leaks into the atmosphere, and then look at it over time. Once a fracked well loses its production, eventually it costs more to keep it in operation than the production will justify. So you cap it and it sits there. Well, what does it look like in 100 years, in 200 years, in 1,000 years? Even over just a few decades, the well casing is going to disintegrate. And all of the efforts, the cementing and all of those efforts that have been put into keeping the fracking fluids separate
Richard, we're not
from, or the natural
you.
gas separate from the water table, all of that breaks down. So, I think if anything, fracking is a bigger environmental problem than is being generally acknowledged at this point. And even though the fracking opponents occasionally exaggerate, from what I've seen, they're basically on the right track. And this is one of the great environmental issues of our time. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with what we've covered. I would just encourage folks to
Richard, thank you. Do you
go to
have
that
any
website, shalebubble.org,
just about at time.
and
Hear from you.
And send that to everyone you know who might be interested in it, who might benefit in some way. The website itself is extremely user-friendly, and we have various ways of aggregating the information, so you don't have to, dive headfirst into hard-to-read charts of depletion rates. Hopefully this will be helpful. I appreciate the opportunity to share the information with you all.
Richard, thank you so much, and thanks for that report. That's really helpful to get those kind of tools into our hands and hands of many people. And so hopefully we'll do this again and get an update from you. I wanted just to mention a couple of things. We have a great online event coming up with Janelle Orsi, who I think you know as well, Richard. She's an attorney with the Sustainable Economies Law Center. She's done a number of webinars for us. We have one coming up on next Tuesday at 11 a.m. Pacific on legal structures for the transition. And then an inner transition workshop on February 28th. And then a conversation with Rob Hopkins a month from today, March 21st at 10 a.m. Pacific time. All those except for the one with Rob, we don't have that up on the website yet. We're waiting for a little blurb, but you can register for the others. And thank you so much, Richard, for being with us. And thank you, Desiree, in the background, for doing such a great job. And thank you to everyone who participated today and everyone who will be viewing this in its recorded form. So have a wonderful day.